Here's one relatively crude way, I think, of politically framing the relationship between feminism and transactivism. And I'll call this the "it's all the fault of feminism and the left" framing. So it goes roughly like this. It's very crude. On the right of the political spectrum, there are the conservatives, and these are the people who reject both feminism and gender ideology. So these are the sensible people. And then on the political left, there are the crazy people who embrace feminism, among other nonsense doctrines, and feminism has embraced gender ideology. So on this framing, gender ideology is the fault of feminism, and feminism is the fault of the left, and there's no credible version of the left or of feminism that stands against gender ideology. So it's all intertwined. And I think of this as roughly the framing of people like Matt Walsh, who just clearly have no time for feminism or any time for gender ideology, and they think a plague on both your houses. They would say feminism of the past is the reason we have gender ideology now. Because they would say it's feminists from the 1960s that started to minimize the differences between the biological sexes, and they started to treat natural biological difference as if it was socially constructed. So they introduced the distinction between sex, biological sex, and gender, by which they meant, what you wear, how you walk, what activities you do, as masculinity and femininity, and they would think they had nothing to do with biology. On this crude framing, gender ideology has sort of continued the project of feminism because it's continued to minimize natural sexual differences to the point at which they're just denied, there aren't any, or everything is cultural, there's nothing natural anymore. And it's true that gender ideology does treat biological sex as completely culturally constructed, basically. So on this framing, we can't expect feminism to offer any kind of principled pushback to transactivism because the two are just too deeply intertwined historically and politically now. Okay, so what does this framing get right? I think it gets a couple of things right, because it's obviously true that historically feminism has downplayed natural sexual difference and emphasized cultural differences between men and women. And it's probably true, I think, almost definitely true, that some feminists have mistaken some natural differences for cultural ones. Transactivism has definitely stolen some of feminists' political strategies in a way that's coming back to haunt us. Feminism has often had a loose relationship to truth and evidence and rationality. And actually there's been a whole feminist project of undermining science as seeing it as male created and therefore detrimental to women. There's a tendency to either cast doubt on science, on biology, for instance, or on social science research, or to selectively cherry pick what works and ignore what doesn't in the service of some kind of political agenda. That's definitely what transactivists are now doing. And there's also in feminism, I think, an overly pernickety emphasis on language, constantly getting everybody to change their words. That's been going on for decades. If you change language, you're seen as doing something politically very significant, much more significant than if you did something economically, different, and that seems crazy to me too. So those are the things I think that framing, that crude framing, gets right. But here's what I think it gets wrong. So this is where I move towards a better framing, I think. So it's not true that gender ideology historically is the preserve of the left. And I know it's maybe hard to see that here, but in the UK, it was conservative governments that brought in all of those policy changes. They brought self-ID. And even now, there are several UK conservative politicians who argue for gender ideology, completely support it. So it's not, this left-right split doesn't work quite as well. And another problem, I think, is with this idea that it's the preserve of the left, not the right, is how corporate friendly it is. And you can see that by how it's been so thoroughly embraced by HR departments. It's the easiest thing in the world for big business to get on board with, the pride flag, the parades, putting your pronouns in your bio, whatever it is. But if it was really that radically socialist or left, I just find it hard to see how it would fit so seamlessly into big business and American corporate life. Now, a further complicating factor is the grassroots groups who've sprung up, and they've mostly come from the left. So the resistance has also come from the women's sector, that is people working in domestic violence refuges or rape crisis shelters, because they've been particularly horrified by the idea that men can just walk in and say, I'm a woman, and have access to traumatized people. So in light of those problems, I think we need a different framing from right is good, sane, and against it all, and the left is bad, insane, and for it all. So this is what I will call the "it's all the fault of liberals," or "it's all the fault of liberalism" framing. And on this framing, which I think is a very interesting one, and I'll have more to say about it in a minute, gender ideology is an offshoot or some kind of corrupt product of liberalism. It's like liberalism on crack. Something's gone wrong. And by liberalism, I mean that many people here are probably attracted to the hugely influential political doctrine with origins in the Enlightenment and the West, and it's dominated Anglo-American and European institutions for centuries. Now, classical liberalism, as you know, I'm sure, has many internal disagreements and varieties, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to pretend that I can condense down its main commitments in 2 minutes. So I would say its central commitments are, metaphysically speaking, humans are to be understood as individuals. So they're not like part of communities first and individuals second. They're individuals first who then can choose to join a community or not. Liberalism is committed to individualism. They think of humans as primarily rational. They have free will, and that is a really important value in liberalism, freedom to rationally reflect on what the good life is and then to follow your own dream and not to be compelled into someone else's dream. Freedom is the ultimate good, or one of the very top goods in life for humans. So seeking moral progress, also technological process through the application of rationality. So we're supposed to be on this arc. The arc of moral progress is bending towards justice or whatever it is. Okay, now, the point to recognize about this is that liberalism is big on the right and the left. It just expresses itself in different ways. So on the right, the emphasis is mostly on economic freedom, a focus on market freedom, free trade, unrestrained capitalism, the best means of securing a society where individuals can pursue their own goods, letting the markets decide and not governments. But on the left, liberals aren't so much concerned with that. They're more concerned with the idea of breaking traditions and cultural norms and seeing traditional old ways as impediments to your freedom. Marriage shouldn't just be for heterosexuals. Let's break that down and now let's have gay marriage, or the nuclear family is some kind of impediment to some people's freedom, so they need to create their own kind of family. So break that all apart, because that's all seen as some kind of obstacle to your personal freedom, potentially anyway. In that context, gender ideology is presented as a bizarre sort of corruption of some of those ideas. It's a corruption that's now spreading like a meme through the population, and it seems very attractive because it pulls on these old liberal tropes about freedom and individualism and being yourself and who you really are, and stuff like that. So, for instance, gender ideology employs the idea of your inner gender identity, the person you really are, and you need self-realization. Never mind about the community around you, never mind about your family, never mind about your relations with other people. It's about as individualistic as it gets. It's like, this is me, you have to accept me, you have to see me the way I want you to see me. Nothing about social identity or physical identity is relevant, it's just how you feel inside. And there's also the idea that your physical body is potentially an obstacle to your freedom. So it's not just the cultural norms and traditions around you, it's your actual body could be an obstacle to your own freedom. And you should be free to change it, to surgically alter it. And that's obviously propped up with some capitalistic idea that you should be able to buy whatever cosmetic surgery you want. If that's the analysis, if that's the basic analysis, that it's liberalism, at least some kind of corruption or extreme weird version of liberalism that's the problem, the framing that I offered you earlier, we've got a better one. So this leaves room for a critique from both the left and the right, because this liberalism is in the left and the right already. Of course, feminism is a highly contested concept. It's just not true, though, that they all capitulated. And it's not true that the left has all capitulated, and it's not true that the right hasn't.